Hey everybody, it's Rudy Basso, the co-owner of Don't Split the Podcast Network. I would like to encourage you, lovely listener, to head on over to our website and give a listen to my show that I host with my brother called Game O'Clock. It is a video game retrospective, introspective, other spectives, all about the kind of games that we love. And to be honest, we love just about every game out there. Game O'Clock released every Thursday. It's fun, it's short, and hey, you'll probably learn something about video games.
Hey everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to let you know that thanks to the good folks at Pelgrane Press, Rudy Basso and I are getting to review the new one-player, one-GM RPG, Cthulhu Confidential, on this very podcast. Before we review, we'll be running the game live on the Don't Split the Podcast Network Twitch channel on Thursday, January 26th. At 1 p.m. Eastern. You can check out our actual play of the game before we review it on this podcast. For more information, go to don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Okay, let's start the show. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking with game designers Mike Shea of Sly Flourish, Wade Rockett, and Ruth Tillman about what they do as GMs when their party goes totally off the rails. It is an amazing conversation, and you are gonna learn a lot. Let's jump right into the good stuff. Here's my chat with them. Okay, everybody, I am here with three amazing game designers. Right now, on Tabletop Babble, we have Mike Shea, Ruth Tillman, and Wade Rockett. Everybody, welcome to Tabletop Babble. We are just going to go around the table real quick and let the listeners know what they might know you from. Mike Shea, why don't we start with you?
So I write for the website Sly Flourish. I'm on Twitter at twitter.com/SlyFlourish. I have the very distinct honor of hosting another podcast on this very podcast network called The DM's Deep Dive. And I just put out a book called Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations.
Yes, one of many excellent publications from Mike. Definitely go to his website and check those out. And check out The DM's Deep Dive, a wonderful podcast on this very network. And Ruth, what might people know your work from?
I've written the Eldritch Icons, which is a series of blog posts over on the Illuminerdi, which are ways of taking the 13th Age world and hacking it with a Cthulhu mythos edge. Some of my more published work is coming up, the new game Gumshoe 1-to-1. I've done a setting scenario for that in New York City, Vivian Sinclair, investigative journalist, and I'm writing a set of 3 more scenarios that follow on to that. I've also written a couple of one-off Trail of Cthulhu and Night's Black Agent scenarios.
Very, very excellent games, and we will actually be reviewing Cthulhu Confidential, the first Gumshoe 1-to-1 game, on Tabletop Babble later on. And we're going to do a live play on our Twitch channel as well, so I'm excited to do
I will be watching.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I hope we play it correctly.
I want to see how people playing it. It's so new.
I know. It seems very intimate. I'm excited to give it a shot. It should be a very intense sort of storytelling experience. And I love the Gumshoe system, so you really can't go wrong with that system. It's great. Wade, what might people know you from?
Well, I do marketing, PR, and some copywriting for Kobold Press, Pelgrane Press, and 13th Age. So if you've seen something that doesn't have my name on it, it might be mine. A tweet, a Facebook post, a blog post, something like that. But in terms of published design, I did a Pathfinder Ravenfolk book for Kobold Press. I worked on Deep Magic 13th Age edition for Kobold, as well as the Midgard Bestiary, and I wrote the adventure The Wreck of Volan's Glory, again, all for 13th Age. And then for Pelgrane Press, I did a 13th Age monthly, another adventure called Temple of the Sun Cabal. And somewhere along the way, I did some editing for Wizards of the Coast. And so there were a handful of articles for Dragon and Dungeon Magazine for 4th edition D&D that I worked on as well.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. And it is, I guess, kind of by coincidence that we have 3 of the biggest 13th age cheerleaders in the world, I would say. And if you have not checked out 13th Age, if you're out there in listener land, you definitely should. It is an amazing game. Really, really great. Combines the best of many editions of Dungeons & Dragons, but I find the greatest elements of the game are the entirely new elements that are brought to it. It's the best of a lot of worlds, including a totally new one, so I suggest diving in. We are going to talk about what happens when players go wildly off script or off the rails, however you want to say it. We've all been there before as GMs, right? We have a plan, we've spent hours prepping an adventure or maybe reading a published adventure, and all of a sudden the players decide they are going to zag when you expected them to zig. And what do we do when this happens? So Wade had this great idea. He brought up this topic and said, what if we go through the different ways that going off script manifests at the table? And I think that's a great way to go through it. So let's talk a little bit about one of the most common ways that players go off the script is that they are given a goal, or they give themselves a goal that you as the DM have prepared for them to accomplish, but then they find a way to accomplish it that you didn't plan for. It's the old dig under the castle wall instead of climbing over it type of thing. And then all of a sudden you got to figure out, how long is this going to take? Is there anything in the basement that they should be surprised for? That sort of thing. So let's talk about this one in particular. How do you handle this at the table when the players find a solution to a problem or a way of accomplishing a goal that you didn't think of or prepare for? And why don't we start with you, Mike Shea?
It's hard for me not to just kind of short circuit the conversation and say, go with it, right? Like that's probably a little too vague and probably not very helpful advice for people. When you say spending many hours preparing your game, I don't think I fall into that category. and I don't fall into that category, A, because I'm very lazy, but B, because for that very reason you mentioned, the more you prepare, the more likely you are to be locked into one train, and then they could veer, and then you're stuck with 3.5 hours worth of material that isn't going to get used. I guess when it actually happens, at some point, I think it's safe to, if it really goes off and it's really far away and you really don't have anything, to just take a quick break and say, I wasn't quite ready for this. Give me 5 minutes. And then try to spend 5 minutes sort of brainstorming about what could happen with the situation.
No, here's what you do, Mike. You say, so you've chosen to dig under the castle wall. Excellent. I'm going to take a bathroom break and I'll be right back.
Yeah,
but
right.
I have something amazing planned for you.
You have 5 minutes in the bathroom, 2.5 is crying, and the other 2.5 is trying to figure out what to do next. Yeah, so I think I'll bookmark a piece of this conversation and say that I think planning ahead how do you plan ahead for somebody to veer to the left, I think is an interesting question. But I think that how you prepare ahead of time and the things you prepare ahead of time can make a big difference in what happens when a situation like that occurs. But I'll bookmark that for later.
Oh, I like that. Very cryptic little tease of advice to come. What do you think, Ruth, when the players find a different way of accomplishing the goal of the adventure that you didn't plan for?
So unlike Mike, I'm probably the polar opposite when it comes to planning. I generally run Gumshoe, and it's fairly heavily content and scene oriented because you've got all these clues and characters and such. But ultimately, 1-to-1 actually is one of the most, well, it's not one of the most scripted. It's just that you have to write very tightly when you're doing it. And so you playtest. And the thing is, though, everything is modular, at least when I'm running investigative types of scenarios. And even the ending could change depending on what the players choose to go on. So either I would decide that either they followed the wrong course, the wrong course. Is there a wrong course? Who knows? That's this story. But they followed the course that I didn't expect, or a course that wasn't even on the radar. And so I either lead them towards one of my next modular things, or I find a way to loop it around. Mm-hmm. So okay, great. We've decided that we're going to take out the local crime syndicate. Well, you have very cleverly stumbled into the fact that this person is actually the linchpin for the local crime syndicate. And this other person that I had planned for you to meet farther down the road is no longer now a dancer. She is a complete underworld, kingpin. So I try to think in terms of what can be changed and what can still be interesting from the ideas, because if I'm doing prep, it generally involves ideas, scenes, locations that I found interesting that I want to allow people to play in. And so what they're actually doing in that location is always up to the player anyway, and how they choose to approach that location and whether they actually enjoy that location. So for me, I was mostly looking at a bunch of tiles and thinking, okay, we just jumped onto a tile over here. Where do I either build a path back to the tiles or just shuffle the tiles towards a completely new ending?
Ah, interesting. Your method, right, is more about the way in which you are prepping your game. Keeping it modular allows you to essentially keep a lot of the prep work you've done, right? And I definitely know what you're talking about. You know, the gumshoe scenarios, because they are mysteries that have a lot of clues, are usually very tightly written. And, impressively tightly written in the one-to-one scenarios. That's really cool. That's good advice. Is sort of changing your mindset about prep is a great way to go. Wade, what do you think? When the players find a way to accomplish a goal that you didn't plan for this sort of methodology, what do you do?
Well, assuming that I'm not completely short-circuited in the moment and have to stare off into space while the wheels in my head churn, and I'm mentally redrawing the maps, there are a couple of things that I do. And I'm going to get both ridiculously pretentious and but also lowbrow here. One of the helpful things that I learned in high school was when we were studying the Odyssey and the Iliad, and they were talking about how poets would stand and orally present these epic poems. Like they would actually stand in front of an audience of people and just recite. And the reason that you see in those poems so many phrases cropping up, like the wine dark sea and, swift-footed such and such, or, Achilles, that honorable man, is that they're actually placeholders while the poet is thinking. And so you can just sort of say something that keeps the momentum going while you are mentally like preparing the next thing you're going to say. And the lowbrow part of that is that I tend to treat my games lately in a very cinematic way. I think of them as movies or TV shows. And since this is something that sort of connects with the way that players often think about things, they picture themselves in Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or something. If, for example, I'm running Call of Cthulhu and I say, okay, well, here is this monster you have to defeat, or this ritual you have to prevent, the players might, having some knowledge of Lovecraft, might say, oh, you know what? We know that the biggest, baddest spell book in the setting is the Necronomicon, so let's go to Miskatonic University and steal it. Which is something that apparently happens in a lot of Cthulhu games, is the players just... It's like, here's this thing I know, let's do that. And it's like, well, I suppose it could help you stop this ritual, but now suddenly this has become, about going to this university in New England and stealing a book from a library. And so I could say, all right, you arrive at Miskatonic University and dark clouds are gathered overhead and the air is heavy with pending rain. And you sense that there is something unsettling within. I mean, and I'm just talking, like coming up with all these cliches. It's like, okay, university steelbook, right? What's, And then once I get myself oriented, there are a couple of ways that I might deal with it. You can hand wave a lot of things because the players only really care about what they see and what's relevant. And so you don't necessarily have to have a map of a university in your head, or you don't have to have a second dungeon underneath the castle wall right at hand, although it's super handy if you happen to have that in your pocket. But you could just paint a vivid word picture of, creepy hallways and, okay, there's going to be security guards there. And hell, maybe there's a Lovecraftian monster that's going to spring out and attack you when you touch the Necronomicon. And that's a exciting confrontational scene that you just sort of pulled out of thin air because you know that the players need to be entertained, and something that's entertaining in that kind of game is a horrible monster jumping out and scaring everyone, and you have to run for your life. So I just had kind of these genre-specific set pieces in my head. It's like, this would be a cool thing to happen if they did this, and then I sort of deploy them. And if I'm really feeling the crunch, then I can ask my players to contribute storytelling. It's like, okay, you were standing in front of Miskatonic University. Tell me one thing that you notice about the university as you're looking at it. And they'll say, well, there's a light in the second story. It's like, yes, the light. And what does the light reveal? And if it's not something that's going to completely freak them out, that's something that you can do to kind of lift the burden from yourself and put it on them. It's like, well, okay, now we're improvising, so let's all improvise instead of just me doing it.
That can be fun for your players and give you ideas, right? So your player comes up with the detail of the light, but that triggers in you, now I know what's going on in there. This is a perfect chance for me to bring in this set piece idea that I had before. Certainly turning it back around on your players when they go off the rails is a great trick. And the idea of having set pieces on hand is definitely a popular one, as proven by the successful Kickstarter, Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations, which is a great book for when your players go off the rails. It's not just for that, but it is a very, very handy thing that I keep in my sort of DM, GM, go bag, right? Because I want to have some ideas ready in case my players do decide, what would make this easier is stealing the Necronomicon, right? Because the Necronomicon, it shouldn't just be a book you can walk in and check out. So I love that. I love turning it around on the players, and I love having a few set pieces, even if they're just in your head, ready to roll.
But I think it might have been on a recent episode of Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff where they actually talked about the let's go steal the Necronomicon trope and said, well, what if it's not there? Like, what if at some point somebody rounded up all of the copies of the Necronomicon and they're hoarded somewhere off in Europe? So you show up at Miskatonic and it's not there, but something or someone else is. Maybe you're arrested by the security guards and taken to the dean of the college, who turns out to be an ally who puts you back on the right track, which I think maybe kind of harks back to what Ruth said is, okay, just find a way to ease them back into the main narrative in a way that's interesting and fun.
And, there's odds are if everybody has this idea, somebody already got to the Necronomicon before you did, right? Or maybe the bad guys went and got it before they started their evil plan because they thought, well, this is the most obvious solution. And this idea of players finding a different way to accomplish a goal of an adventure that you didn't plan for, the methodology is actually one of my favorite ways for players to go off the rails. The second sort of point, that the players abandon your story completely and come up with their own goal, is one of my least favorite ways that players go off the rails, because it's a lot harder to ease them back into your story. You're on total improv mode then at that point. And sometimes there are certainly groups of players out there who look to do that just because they want to torture their DM and they're sadists. But then there are other groups that, I had a group, we were playing some Dungeons and Dragons, and they got to a city, and I was talking about how it was a city of pirate hunters, kind of some flavor I was talking about, some ships at the wharf that were hunting pirates, and they were like, well, we want to go join those guys. That sounds awesome. Let's go hunt some pirates, And so all of a sudden they're off on this other mission. Instead of going to slay the dragon, they're going to slay some pirates. So what do you do here when the players abandon your story completely and come up with something else that they want to do? Because in some ways this could be your players saying, like, we don't think that goal is interesting and we want to do something else.
I don't think I've ever had a game that went that far that quickly, right? Like, I've had games evolve over time, and I've had things change up quite a bit, but it's usually not that abrupt, right? And usually the focus of the main storyline is still there, just the approach that the characters are taking is different than what I expected. But I haven't had one say, like, hey, fighting all these giants is really boring, and they mentioned something about pirates. We're going to go be pirates. I think that with a lot of these ideas, having a point of sort of stepping back for a moment and stepping outside the game and having a different conversation about the kind of game people want to have can be valuable. I think it's valuable to have that before you ever start any campaign. And I hope DMs do that, right? Like, I never say, hey, everybody, I just bought, Storm King's Thunder and I want to run it. come on over, we're going to play. They probably would. They probably go, oh, okay. But I'd rather say, like, look, we can run Storm King's Thunder, or we can run Out of the Abyss, or we can run, we can do a homebrew thing, or we can run some old modules that we convert. I don't usually leave it so open-ended as to say, what kind of game do you want? And I'll figure it out. But I might offer 3 or 4 different options of things so that they've already got the buy-in to say, like, yeah, a game, I referred to Storm King's Thunder, for example, as this is going to be Rick Steves' guide to the Sword Coast. It's going to be a vacation, compared to the last, apocalyptic ones, it's going to be more of a vacation where you guys get to explore the nooks and crannies of the Sword Coast, and they'll be probably giants. And if they're into that, then they go, yeah, that sounds really cool. That's what we're doing. It's like, nah, I'd really rather have something with more tension, or, something a little bit more immediate, or I'm bored to death of the Sword Coast and I want to do something else. Hopefully they would say so before we got started. So I think if it did happen to me, I would probably take that step back, talk to the group, and sort of re-baseline and say, we can keep going from here and we can go to this other kind of adventure if that's what you're interested in. If it's something that the DM is not interested in, that could be a problem. Like if they're like, hey, we want to be pirates. You're like, man, I hate pirates. Then it might be time to go apocalyptic and just end it and then start a new campaign.
It's important for the GM to have fun too.
Oh yeah. I mean, if we're not I don't think if we're not having fun, I don't think the players are going to have fun no matter, even if we're running exactly the kind of thing they want to run. If we don't like it, they're not going to like it.
That's a good point. That's like definitely true that it's the trickle-down effect. It starts with the GM. The GM's got to be having fun for the players to have fun. But I love, Mike, both times you've said now that it's okay for the GM to be honest. It's okay for the GM to say, oh, I wasn't expecting this. Give me a couple minutes so I can figure this out. Or, oh, this was really what I had planned, but since you guys don't want to go there, let's talk about it. What do you really want to do? And figure it out from there. And also, again, as part of your prep for the game, having that conversation with your players beforehand and saying, this is what I was thinking about, but what were you guys thinking about? Or I have all these options. What do you want to do? Is a great way to go. I remember, Mike, you were when you were getting ready to run Curse of Strahd, which is the Ravenloft update that Wizards of the Coast just came out with, you said, we've talked about it, and this guy's going to approach them with a note, just like the old module starts out with, that brings them into the realm of Barovia. But if they don't go that way, the Drow will capture them, and then they will end up in Out of the Abyss, which I thought was great. Like, that was great preparation for your players going off.
Well, I was kind of half kidding. I didn't really expect that to happen.
Sure.
But yeah, if it did, it did. Yeah. If I can have one other little trick that I found, and I think the constant feedback can be important. If a group is saying, like, we don't want to do that, we're going to go do this other thing, they could be like screwing with the DM because they know the DM has already laid out this whole path. That's sort of a joke. But one thing that I try to do at the end of every game is say, so what did we enjoy and what do we want to see more of? And sometimes they're like, nope, great, having fun, love it. See you next week, right? And I don't always get a lot of real substantial feedback. Or I get like, I had one guy who's like, I love the idea that you gave us this problem and it was clear you had no idea how we were going to solve it. And you kind of left it up to us to solve it. He goes, I love that part. I thought that was really a good thing. I think by asking questions like that at the end of a adventure, each adventure, you're going to get an idea if people aren't happy with the way things are going. And just to kind of reiterate that asking that question up front can have a factor. I did it with Storm King's Thunder. I'm running both my groups with almost all the characters having the same faction. And one group picked Harper's and the other picked Zinterim. That's fantastic because I'm like, I don't know how the hell is this Zinterim game going to work? I don't like evil campaigns in general, but I thought about it. I was like, no, I think this could be fun. It's like gangsters, it's like Godfather, but in the Sword Coast. And now I didn't expect to like it nearly as much as I did. It gave me wonderful plot hooks that are way better, well, in my opinion, way better than what's in the book. And the characters, the players are having a ball because they're like, oh, I just love that there's like these internal factions as Interim and we're fighting off competition while at the same time having to deal with all the other trials that are going on. Kind of like my clue earlier, I think spending a little time up front to be prepared for something like that, or to give players the options to give that feedback before they just derail you in the middle of a game might be an approach.
Definitely. And I love what you just said, when you said your player, you gave us a problem but didn't know the solution. I think that is always great to do when you're drawing out challenges in particular game systems, because it will make you more open to the solutions then that your players come up with, right? So if you're writing your own material and you present a challenge, you're more open to it when a player has a spell that just automatically circumnavigates it, or when somebody thinks outside the box and decides to, smash the puzzle box against the wall instead of try to open it. You're more open to that sort of thing. Hey everybody, James Introcaso here. We are going to take a quick break because I wanted to let you know today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. For listeners of Tabletop Babble, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a 30-day free trial to give you the opportunity to check out their amazing audiobook service. One book Audible thinks that listeners of this podcast might like is Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. You can pick up that audiobook or any other free audiobook of your choice at audibletrial.com/DSPN. That's audibletrial.com/DSPN for your free audiobook today. Okay, everybody, let's get back to that great conversation. Ruth, we are talking about what happens when your players go completely off script, when they look at the story hooks you have for them and they say, we'd rather actually go over here, right? It's when Night's Black Agents decide to pursue werewolves instead of Dracula. What advice do you have for people when they're going through there? Mike was saying that he likes to have a frank conversation with his players if anything like that happens. And he has one before the campaign begins to sort of talk to them about, like, what are our goals here? What do we want to accomplish? What kind of game do you want to play? To avoid that sort of thing. What about you? What do you think?
I think that's generally the best. So the best solution, if you haven't done it ahead of time, to sort of pause for a second. One of my favorite stories about players going off script was I was running a personal hack of the Eternal Lies overarching story arc by Will Hindmarch and Jeff Tidball for Trail of Cthulhu. And I had this segment worked out where I'd sort of brought in a few pieces and put them all together. And there was this one particular fight very early on that I had retained from the original. And part of the point of the fight was that you got these guys with, I think they were Yakuza tats, but I can't be sure, that jump you in an alley in Atlanta, in Savannah. So, right, that's the idea, is that it's a world-spanning campaign. I needed a fight, and I made the mistake of leaving in those guys and not changing their origin and not because there's really otherwise no reason for them to be there, but it's a slow start. So I was like, yeah, sure, an early fight. I ran the game for 2 groups of players, and the first group became immediately convinced that what had happened was somebody had really, really messed up with like some East Asian mob group, and that they were being hunted by them. And so what had been sort of an Atlanta-centric adventure with an eventual migration to an old house was a flight through the Georgia countryside to get away from these guys. And so I was like, all right, hold up. Like, pause on the brakes. Like, I was trying to run with it, and I was trying to get them ready to do stuff. And then I was like, okay, wait. I totally let them run with the idea that this guy who had bitten them in this other encounter that they'd had might be contagious. And I totally let them like sear their flesh to make sure that they didn't. I'm like, yeah, sure, it's a Lovecraftian game. I'm absolutely okay with you heating up knives and searing your flesh. But like, that was an off script that I was cool with. The running through, I was like, I have literally nothing in the Georgia countryside. Like, there's just no way I can do this. So what I did was I was like, all right, I gave them a waypoint. And when they decided to stop at this waypoint, I sort of like helped them recalibrate, and I was like, okay, here's some clues about where it could take you next. And I picked like the ideas that the 100%, but I was like, okay, the East Asian tats, not actually the core clue. Like this clue over here. And I thought this was my bad adapting bigger material into something small. So like I owned up to that. This was my mistake, that I really just I was not capable at that point anyway of pulling some sort of Georgia countryside East Asian martial arts something together, which would have been really badass if I could have done it, but I just couldn't.
No, and I think that's another good way to do it too, right? Is maybe there's some sort of waypoint, like you said, or some sort of Deus Ex Machina that comes down to provide maybe some more information to make a particular point more enticing or help clarify something that maybe the players got wrong, or give them more clues that make them say like, wait, hold on, this thing about cattle getting raided is actually about vampires in the night. Well, that sounds a lot cooler. Let me, head on over that way.
Although, I mean, you can grab werewolves, If you have to grab werewolves, okay. Yeah, you're right. It was werewolves.
Right? Because you're the only one who knows those details, and you can change those if you need to, which is great. Wade, what do you think when players go totally off script, completely off the wall, out of their off script? What did Wade Rockett do?
Wade Rockett can do any number of things. The first question that comes into my head in that situation is this happening because the players are bored and are trying to entertain themselves? Or is it because I have not provided enough cues to guide them in the direction that I want? So this awesome adventure fighting dragons that I have set up is nowhere near as enticing as the idea of chasing pirates. Again, maybe they go off and fight pirates, but or maybe I pause it somehow and break the fourth wall and say, actually, this whole adventure is about fighting dragons. I mean, if you want to fight pirates, you can. I can't guarantee it'll be any good because I'll be making it up. But, I just want to let you know.
Also, who doesn't want to fight a dragon? Come on, guys. Come on.
Maybe it's a dragon lord of pirates.
Ooh, that's... I like that. I like that as a way to
propose
get
that module. 13th Age.
Okay,
Dragon Lord of Pirates.
On it.
Dibs!
But talking about kind of setting expectations beforehand, a lot of it depends on whether I'm running a one-shot or a campaign.
Yes.
With a 13th Age campaign especially, but I think kind of in general, y'all meet maybe during character creation or maybe even before then and kind of talk about what's this going to be like. My 13th Age campaign was very much shaped by the choices that the players made during character creation. So going into it, I already had a pretty good idea of what each person was looking for. And so I could kind of seed the campaign with hooks that appealed to everybody. So everybody got a turn in the spotlight and there wasn't much of an opportunity for people to get bored. Also, when I am talking about what's going on and putting hooks out there and having stuff happen in the background, I generally have a lot of options in mind. I'm deliberately putting out bait and seeing what the players take. It's like, okay, the main thing I want to have happen is that there's going to be this masquerade ball at the Count's castle, and that's where the secret conspiracy of evil wizards is going to try make a last-ditch effort to kidnap the elf sorceress in the party. However, there's about 3 to 5 other things going on that if the players decide to chase after that, then I am at least somewhat prepared to follow up with that. And then we can get back to the masquerade ball or not, depending on where the player's excitement is. So I'm always sort of monitoring them and taking their temperature and just seeing what gets them excited and invested and kind of going with that. There was an arc where they were investigating charges of diabolism against a local dwarf merchant. And I had a rich NPC invite them all over for dinner and try to bribe them into dropping the case. And to me, it's just because, the local merchants didn't want to make waves. It's bad for business to have somebody investigated by the Inquisition. The players all became convinced that he was a bad guy. And they started investigating him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's kind of like with the tattooed Asian thugs in the alley. It's like, well, yeah, okay. In hindsight, that is a pretty big red flag to wave in front of them.
Yeah, mea culpa on that one.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, okay, well, so he ended up being a villain in my campaign, and there's a whole other kind of undercurrent going through about his involvement with smuggling weapons out to the orcs. Let's not let my players know that this is coming out because I haven't told them that yet. So there's that. So set expectations. Have multiple things going on that you're prepared to jump to in case one thing doesn't excite their interest. You have other things. Another thing that I do when I'm running adventures to keep it from going completely off the rails is I don't give the players a chance to take things off the rails. One thing that has absolutely killed convention demos I've run, and usually I'm smart enough not to do this, but every once in a while I will have the PCs all meet up and I say, okay, do you all decide to go off adventuring together? And inevitably there's 5 to 10 minutes of, oh, how can I trust this strange elf from the... That's like, oh, God, no, just go adventuring together. So a lot of times I'll just say, all right, you have set off into the woods, and now you find yourself face-to-face with armed and angry orcs, and suddenly it's a fight. And it's like, oh, okay, we're here, and we're doing it. We're on this adventure. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of railroading just to get them pointed in the right direction, and from there I can kind of handle whichever way they decide to go with it.
Yes. Yeah, I like to do, as a sort of an icebreaker, even for one-shots, go around the table, right, and I say, oh, okay, this is your second quest together or mission together. In the last mission, you were, fighting kobolds or fighting Soviets or whatever it was, and look to the person to your left. They saved your life. How did they do it? Go.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's a sort of, it's a little off topic, but I use something similar where I say, okay, you've all at least worked with each other once before. I have 10 relationship slips. I throw a bunch out on the table, say, grab one, tell me the fact about the person to your left. So saved your life, owes you a debt. There's a secret you'll never tell. What's the secret you'll never tell? Why did you stop talking to them? But I like Kevin Culp introduced me, probably the best in media res. And I don't think you were in this game, Mike, but it was at DC Game Day. Half of us were defusing a bomb and half of us were in midair without parachutes.
You already split the party and you hadn't even started yet.
Yeah. So it's all right, and it was basically a quick intro to get yourselves up to speed. And he said, just blow all your skills because you get a refresh. And so we were spending points left and right to be amazing to get.
Nice. I took your parachutes away, but I'll tell you, you're getting a rest.
Uh-huh. Nice. I imagine that it is very hard to go off script when every direction leads to you hitting the ground and dying.
Yeah. Wow, that's fun, and I'm stealing it.
Yeah, it was one of the starters I've ever been in.
Definitely. Well, and I think we've already touched on sort of the next point, which is your players. They can go off script because they want to, which I think does warrant a good out of game conversation. And then your players can go off script because they fundamentally misread something or they make a mistake. What do we do then? Is it right to sort of keep the immersion of the story, and try to gently guide them back on track, or is it right to say, hold on, I think you guys are misunderstanding what's going on here. This is what I'm saying. You found werewolf teeth, not vampire teeth at the scene, just to continue this crazy vampire werewolf metaphor.
One really silly thing that I do at my table, because I've played with this group long enough to get away with it, is I will have NPCs actually break the fourth wall, and a dwarf will say something like, "Look, my only function in this adventure is to get you to go through that door. Okay, that's the only reason I exist. Please go through the door."
I'm begging you. I just need to retire this accent.
Yes.
Mike, do you want to talk about Lord Retcon for a little bit?
Lord Retcon. I forgot Lord Retcon. I think I yeah. But I love blaming characters for changes in story, right? I love to say well, you misunderstood this thing that was true 10 seconds ago and now isn't true anymore, right? And I guess it's like gaslighting. I like gaslighting the characters. It's clearly my screw up, and everybody knows it's my screw up, but I like to blame it on the characters instead.
So sometimes when we've got a direction, that direction is you thought that was an ironclad clue, and they see maybe that it could be two things, and you say, oh yes, you have cleverly noticed that this clue could mean two different things. And then if they follow up on the other thing, you give them a clue actually you have uncovered this other smaller thing that was going on. So you give them a small win, but the real truth behind it is this other must be the other thing, because this one, you've resolved it. Congratulations. The DA thanks you for your service. Or, but now, it must have been the other one. So if you state to the people if they're having trouble deciding and they decide to go with the wrong one, but there has actually been discussion raised, then you can make it a matter of, yes, I intended both of those, and you took it the way that leads to the shorter end. So you've resolved your subplot.
Right.
I think I remember Lord Retcon now. He was this old guy that lived in Sigil and had an enormous leather-bound tome. And in it was the entire history of the multiverse. And he could go into any particular, he would pop in the different parts of the world, different parts of the multiverse. And he would look at something and kind of shake his head and say, that's not right. And he'd open his great big book and he'd scratch something out and write something else in. And that thing happened, and he was an in-game NPC that was, specifically altering the fabric of the universe while it was happening. It was very handy thing to have.
Really good for getting players back on track, but also for correcting your own mistakes as a DM, which is another podcast, I think.
Yeah.
That we could probably go for hours and hours on. One thing I want to talk about is, speaking of hours and hours, the players, Ruth, you brought this one up, the players stumbling on to the solution to a case or a problem early, and now all of a sudden you have 3 hours left because they figured out that, Lord Summerisle was going to make them sit in a big wicker man and light it on fire before they had to, go through the rigmarole of figuring out what was going on. They just knew. They were like, listen, Christopher Lee, you're done. And they took him on, and now
what are we going to do
the rest of this time, right? So, spoilers, by the way, for the Wicker Man. Sorry, audience.
Wow, I hadn't. Well, that's fine.
It still works.
It still works.
Still the best horror movie ever done.
So, Wade, what do you do when this happens? What's the solution? How do you still save the time you had left to game?
It depends on when that happens and how badly it blows everything. If it happens within an hour, then I have really messed up. If the evening was supposed to last, say, 5 hours. As a GM, in addition to thinking about my game cinematically, another way that I've kind of come to think about it in a way that's helpful to me is imagining what the consequences are of different things happening. So, for example, when I made the mistake of attracting the player's attention with this one rich guy who, with a throwaway name that I just sort of made up off the top of my head, who invited them to a meal and tried to bribe them, when they became convinced that he was one of the villains of the piece, I'm like, okay, what are the consequences of them believing that and acting on it? Who's going to get rattled? Who's going to try to intervene? How does that shake up the balance of power in the city? What group of monsters is going to spring out of the PCs from a dark alley one night and try to take them down? And so in a case where they solve your adventure, quote unquote solve, whether it's a mystery or something else, really quickly, try to think in advance of what could happen next as a result of that. So this is wrong and bad. Don't at me on Twitter. If somebody figures out a way how to get into White Plume Mountain and grab Black Razor without having to fight a single monster, because for me the whole point of White Plume Mountain is to get your hands on Black Razor. It's okay, well now they have Black Razor. Who else wanted that but didn't go in because White Plume Mountain is really freaking dangerous? And is somebody going to try to buy it from them? Is somebody going to try to steal it from them? Is someone going to attack them? And so it's okay. And then again, with those kind of set pieces in mind, it's pretty easy to come up with a group of monsters, especially if you happen to have, with 13th Age, there are a couple of books called Battle Scenes, which are just, here is a group of monsters with some interesting terrain that you can kind of slot into an adventure. There's also the 13th Age demo, which has groups of monsters that are sort of themed with several of the icons. And so you can just say, a local Hellmarsh priest who serves the Diabolist really wants Black Razor, and so therefore some gnolls and a summoned demon are going to attack the party and try and take it from them. And then they will say, here is some gnolls and a summoned demon. Clearly they must have some sort of base that we need to clear out. And so there's a whole other adventure. It's all right, now we have to raid the demon temple. So that's kind of my approach, is just think about what the ripple effects are of the PC's actions and then those are my next adventure hooks that I'm going to throw out there.
I do think it's a good idea to have some materials on hand. Those remember those adventures that you bought but have never run. The PDFs you have sitting in your hard drive or that sort of thing. You're able to pull from those. That's why those books like Battle Scenes and Dungeon Delve and again Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations exist, right? Ruth, what about you? What do you think when there's 3 hours left in the game? What do you do?
Well, one of the fun things about running horror-style games is that you want to give the players a satisfactory ending, but you never want it to be too happy. So, I mean this in the best way. Like the trail game that I have run at a lot of conventions. I wrote it, God love me, like 3 years ago. I was like, yeah, no, it's fine. Don't give me any pre-adventures. I'll write my own thing a month beforehand. Actually, it was like 2 months beforehand. And so I wrote it, play tested it at home, brought it to Gen Con. And I've run it a number of times since. And it ends with this idea of this realization that the world that you live in is not, that is inhabited by this particular like thing. And I'm not going to spoil it because it's about to come out in print, I believe. The publication got a little delayed. But so I asked players to deal with those consequences sort of as part of the ending to the game. And so for me, that's like the automatic that these scenarios give you some kind of next thread. And so, okay, for my Dracula dossier one, okay, you've run out of, you got the ballerina vampires, which obviously everybody saw that one coming, but like you successfully got them, deported from the UK maybe because like, I don't know how you could get it done that fast unless you had Thatcher come in and deport them. I don't know. And Thatcher wasn't the prime minister at the time. Don't at me. It's a long story. Play the game. But anyway, like, okay, great. Now you need to take out, the hive that they originally came from on the continent. Or, great, you've learned that this town that you're in southern Alabama is connected to this huge network of this related to this particular monster. Like, so I would say maybe there's a hive now. Like you've realized that they're coming from somewhere. And so throw together off the top of my head, I'm like, an old priest diary. That, if you go through the things, you find the diary of a priest that hunted them before, and it gives you some clues. Like, magically, you're going to find this church that was built to seal them, and the church has been somehow uprooted. And I'm just actually making this one up off the top of my head, because I came up with different solutions, and I can't say any of them, because they would be too close to the plot. Yeah, you've come, this church that this guy found in, and he used it as his base for hunting them, so you found the centralized thing for destroying these. So now, like, your actual mission of the game, that was the warm-up. Your central core mission is to actually destroy this. And I think horror games always imply that something is connected to something bigger. And so the difficulty then is how to make sure that you work that into an adventure that could only be 3 hours or so if you're, playing a con game or a one shot. I love that story, Wade, with the rich guy, because I totally would be that player who would be like, well, Wade introduced a rich guy who wants to stop me from looking into this. Guilty.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, and that makes perfect sense that, sometimes players think this is the villain or this isn't. My players, I think I've had so many NPCs betray them that now they just trust no one whenever they meet someone new, and that's kind of on me. I have given them that distrust. So I definitely think that makes sense. But yeah, those are really good points about what to do when you're short on adventure and long on time. Mike Shea, what do you do?
Well, so one thing, and I'm having flashbacks to the conversation I had with Enrique a few days ago about tactics, about battle tactics, and he brought up a point which I've often believed, which is he considered himself not a very tactical DM, and I don't consider myself a very tactical DM. And when you have one brain against like 5 or 6 other brains, and you're in any kind of competitive state, you're going to lose, right? And the mysteries feel the same way to me, right? Like if I know that there's a guy that's going to betray the party, they're going to immediately sniff him out, right? They're going to immediately murder that guy, and whatever mystery I had is going to be gone. So I kind of think of it like going more with Cormac McCarthy than a mystery, and just saying, here's situations that occur, and here are things that have happened. And if the party figures it out, great. It still happened, and it's still they still have problems that they have to solve, right? They can't, even if they know what happened, even if they know, I'm going to go back to the Wicker Man, right? Even if they figured out, even if that cop figured out that he's been duped and that he's on this island because they're going to burn him to death, it doesn't mean he's not on the island, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not going to chase him around with donkey heads on and through the streets until they stick him in a wicker thing and burn him to death. So he's got to figure out, how the hell am I going to get off this island, right? They just burned my boat. One thing is, like, my obvious game of choice is these days is 5e. And then, secondary and tertiary games are also tend to be more of your your D20-ish sort of games. And the nice thing about those games is they give you a lot of time to kind of think about things because there's battles. And battles, even in 5e where they're so much better than 4e, they're still, and 13th Age, which also has wonderful battles, they still take enough time that you don't, you got a half hour or 45 minutes to kind of say what's going to happen after this battle's over. But in Gumshoe, like, I don't know how, and Fate feels the same way, right? That you're constantly going, like,
it's, well, and that's why I love it. But
right. That's why you like it. That's. I mean, it's fun. But where I only have to come up with 5 scenes to fill 4 hours. You better have 20, right? You need like 20 scenes to fill up 4 hours. But I think thinking of those scenes as sort of individual sandboxy sort of environments where there's there's a location, there's interesting bits of the location, there's interesting characters and their motivations, there's a situation that occurs. And maybe the party doesn't know the answer, maybe the characters don't know the answer, and maybe they do. But either way, the situation's still going on. And that way, I know for me, that gets me out of the idea of like, I've got a secret and I don't want the characters to figure it out because they will, right? We're all watching the same movies. We're all reading the same books. We're all playing the same games. So any inspiration that I happen to get for something, they have too. That's helped me a lot.
I definitely wrote the sentence earlier this week, which is if at this point your player correctly figures out that so-and-so is definitely behind it, ask them how they're going to go about proving that. Because, sure, a player could decide at this point, I have solved the case, but, you're just about the keys and extort,
You need the evidence. Yeah.
Right. You definitely have to. So, I noted, I realized at this point, if you're playing this through a specific group of scene paths, you could have gotten to the point where you have this logical conclusion, but you're definitely not going to be able to prove it enough to get people to, I don't know, maybe tase a guy and strip him and do some other things to figure out if he's actually done it or not.
2 other tricks. So one was one that I wrote in an adventure, in an AL adventure called what was the one with the monster at the end? I guess they all have monsters at the end.
The monsters at the end of this book.
End of the book.
And the monsters at the end of the book. But the main thing was there was a guy who was clearly an incubus, and he got into the town
innocent.
and the innocent. Yeah, and the party immediately knew that it's an incubus. Like, it's not hard for the party to figure out, but the incubus has duped everyone else. So the party still has to recognize the fact that, the incubus has obviously nailed his way into the town and duped the main guy and is dragging him off to his death. We got to save the guy. Right. So that way there's still sort of a mystery, but it's not their mystery. It's the mystery of another NPC. And then the other trick is if you know that somebody betrayed the party, if you don't know who it is, then they can't figure out who it is. So you could have here's 7, if you go to your clue, right? What if you don't know who murdered the person? You got 7 people and it could have been any of them, but you get to decide later who it actually was. Right. And
it is fun to do that.
And maybe the party does figure it out, and you're like, sounds good, but you better not tip your hand, right? Because too much. I think that's one of the things about sort of improving things. And I'm pretty bad at this. My group knows when I don't have anything because I'm rolling a lot of dice and I'm reading a lot of bad names off of my random name generator, and they know well, that couldn't have been important. If you just made the name up right now, that can't be too valuable. Tipping a hand too soon makes the whole world feel too ethereal, and so how do you improvise but still make it look like the world is a solid place is a tricky bit with this whole subject, I think.
One thing I liked that Robin did in Cthulhu Confidential is that I think that it was 2, but maybe it was just 1 for his scenario. We all have a scenario in it. His is the Fathomless Sleep, which is a really fun LA noir style game, and he tells you 2 other possible solutions, and depending on how you play, those other possible solutions could be the right solution. So the idea is, as your character is playing, if your character happens to head more in this direction, just roll with it. Here's the basics of what happened. It still follows a lot of the same things, and this other person who was sort of a red herring is behind it. Because, yeah, if a player makes a more convincing case that somebody else did the thing or that this thing is the thing, and everybody at the table believes it, or in this case, you've got this one intense player with probably 2 pages of notes that they've compiled, and they come to you and they say, oh, yeah, it was this person. You say, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. This is the one lead you still have open to follow. How, are we planning to go take them down or, whatever, get to the bottom of this once and for all? And then you roll with it. And, because there's still, as you said earlier, you're still on the island with the boat burned or whatever. Mike, actually, this whole thing reminded me of one time where if we'd been in a longer game, I think we would have thrown off your game. But you were sandboxing enough that, and it was a local convention game that we were playing. And I'm trying to remember exactly what we were doing, but we were going over hot lava, and somewhere along the thing we'd acquired this very recently acquired this jeweled skull, and somehow literally nobody on the party wanted it. And so
it's like. That's the demi-lich, right? Like,
yeah, it was the demi-lich.
Demi-lich, yeah.
Yeah, but we got we got this skull and we're by this lava and nobody wanted the skull and everybody's like, no, that's a cursed skull. Are you kidding? Skulls with jewels just don't hang out. So we punted it into the lava.
Right, and the great bit is it was a good guy.
Yeah,
right. So nobody reckoned. Yeah, so that was a mashup of I took and this is apt given the new modules that are coming out. It was Tomb of Horrors, White Plume Mountain, and Ravenloft mashed into one big dungeon,
which is amazing.
And it was set in Omen. Yeah, so in Omen they all smashed together, right? And some lord took them all over, but he had Strahd as his prisoner. And had Strahd's all emaciated and on a chain, right? And the demons got
oh my gosh.
And somebody found a Sararak's skull, and a Sararak's I just want to go back to the way things were. This sucks, right? I don't want the demon. So he was willing to work with the party, but the party's no, demi-lich into the lava.
Yeah.
And so you go, okay, that happened.
Jeweled skulls just don't hang around in caves. And so afterward, Mike told us what we'd done. We were like, oh.
The other one was never letting Strahd loose either, right? Strahd, I think he was telepathically communicating with the party to say let me go and I'll help you. And everyone's no, I'm not letting you go. And you're well, okay, you fight the demon on your own.
I ran a story arc in my 13th Age campaign last year where the characters were trapped in a forest and they had angered the spirit of the forest. And so it was just relentlessly trying to kill them and would not let them leave. And one of my players had no experience with RPGs before and was clearly kind of unsettled by the fact that all the other players' response to this situation was, well, we have to find out whatever's causing this and kill it. And she's like, why do we have to kill it? And so at one point she said, part of you've been saying over and over that this forest is wounded. Could I use a ritual to heal it? And everyone just sort of blinked. And I said, yes, you could. And so kind of like we've been talking about where the investigative part of the adventure ends when the players all say, oh, well, clearly it's that guy. And then it becomes a different kind of adventure. How are you going to prove it? Or how are you going to hide from Christopher Lee's followers as they're trying to kill you on this island and escape or something like that? So it's okay, well, healing the forest means that all of the fighty bits that lead you to the confrontation with the spirit of the High Druid are now kind of off the table if this works. But now it's become a different kind of adventure where you're going to try to do this ritual to heal the forest and then negotiate with the spirit of the High Druid to resolve what its problem is, rather than go into battle. And it ended up being a much more satisfying adventure.
And that's the thing is, right, going off the rails and going off script can lead to a great story, because I think Mike's point about battle, right, one mind can't take on 5. Similarly with storytelling, right? Collaborative storytelling can result in a greater story than just one person telling it. I think it's one reason so many of us love these games. Otherwise, we would just sit there telling stories to ourselves, right? And one of the things that I always think about is when people finish up early, or even when people don't finish early, I always think about this. We spend all this time making or rolling on random encounter charts and, stocking our dungeons full of deep ones and dragons and things like that. And then it's always just a simple walk back. Like, it's always a cakewalk back out of the dungeon or back from where you came from. And like Mike said, you've got all these people running around trying to kill you in the Wicker Man. Sometimes you come back home and it's like the scouring of the Shire, right? You think that Lord of the Rings is over. And again, spoilers for the book if you haven't read it, I guess. But, you know, the hobbits get home and all of a sudden the Shire is trashed and they have to do something about it. So there's always that approach, too, of, you know, the consequences of your actions of taking action, right? Like, you chose to leave home, which left home then vulnerable to the forces of evil. The crazy czar who was the next county over decided to take over, or whatever it is. So, you know, you have those options, and I think this has been great. This has been a real masterclass full of amazing examples and stories of what to do, but it seems like you all have very memorable stories about going off the rails, which is great, and which is why I think it's a thing that we tend to roll with rather than try to prevent, which is really nice. And I think it's something you learn through experience. I think, you know, a lot of times first GMs, particularly if you're starting when you're not an adult, think that they're supposed to, you know, rule the story with an iron fist, and that's definitely not the case. So with that in mind, how can players, and this will be sort of our final question as we wrap up here, how can players do a good job of going off the script? What can they do for us as GMs when, you know, maybe they found that, oh no, I've gone off the script. What is the best way? What's the best thing for them to do? Wade, we'll start with you.
I think the best thing that players could do is go into a tabletop RPG game with the attitude that it is every player's responsibility to contribute to everybody having fun. And so if you're going to go off the rails, make it be a fun thing. And if it is clearly just like completely destroying all of the fun that the GM had for the night, either consider backtracking a little bit and say, oh, okay, we're going to go fight the dragons, or do what you can to make it easier for the GM to improvise this new adventure you've decided to go on. You know, step forward and present ideas and just kind of enthusiastically collaborate on this new thing that you've decided to do. And I think it'd be just as fun.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Ruth, what do you think?
Being engaged is probably, it's the thing I want most from players at a table, because when I have players that are engaged and they're all engaged, it really makes for an amazing story. And so on that, the GM will generally be trying to help other players be engaged. And some people are going to want to only contribute a little bit to the story, and some people are going to want to contribute a lot. And that's, you know, people have different styles when approaching the table. But I think my two pieces of advice was, first, like, be engaged, dig in, you know, like Wade's example, don't spend 5 minutes like you're going on an adventure. If you do come into a totally sandbox situation, you know, roll with what the person is expecting, and then roll with what comes up. Roll with how you think it's going. So buy in when you clearly should be buying in, and when you're handed an more open world, then yeah, start playing around with it with other people at the table. But then listen to the other players so that you're not then dominating this and being that one person who tries to derail the thing, or who says, well, I'm going to go take this book of spells off over here. And like, okay, you can do that. There was a game of the, what's the zombie apocalypse world? Elsa's game. Dead Scare. Yes. But I was in a number of the early playtests for that. And in one of them, a guy actually hid in a bunker. He wanted to win this post-apocalyptic game, so he hid in a bunker. And like, that's not how you game. That's not how you do this thing. And so, yeah, so being in the game not to win it, but to create the best experience that you can with the other players at the table. It's Dead Scare, and it's very fun, and the Kickstarter-backed version is about out, and there should be digital copies very soon. But yeah, that's a game that requires player buy-in. But you know, if you have a blank game that's like, yeah, you are housewives in the 1950s when the zombies attack and all the men are gone, go. Yeah, it's like you don't hide in a bunker, you kill some zombies.
Yeah, and I think that's always the player who plays the adventurer who is like, well, why would I leave home? It's like, that's your job, right? You might the adventurer. So
why did she leave home?
Yeah, exactly. Again, turn it around on them. That's great. And thank you for turning me on to this game, because I'm definitely going to check out the Dead Scare when it comes out. And Mike Shea, what about you? What advice do you have for players?
Again, working with the DM, remembering I've on occasion in some organized play events had the player who's like, well, that's not what my character would do, or my character, I had that what Wade mentioned before of the I don't know why I would trust these other people. I'm going to go off and do my own thing. And I think probably number one is remembering that before the game even begins, cooperation among the characters. You don't have to come up with a good reason for that. Just start doing it. Right. And it's great when we have a game system that does that. Numenera has built-in stuff for that. Dungeon World has built-in stuff for that. There's a bunch of stuff about how to do that in pretty much any game. And that helps. But even if you don't have that, if you're a player and you're just sitting at the table, find a reason to be sympathetic to the other characters and connected to them, even if one's not given to you. Just latch yourself on. Say, like, maybe you and I, just do it yourself, right? Just point at one of the other characters and say, maybe you and I did a job together. Or, maybe, remember that time you got me out of jail? And the other person will riff right off you. Go, oh, yeah, especially if you put yourself at the disadvantage, right? Like, I was one time dying and this person saved me. Or, I was in jail and got broken out by this person. If the other person helped you, they're a lot more likely to latch on to the idea that their character became a hero because of you. That's probably the biggest one. That's a big one for me, I think, is finding a reason to get the characters tied together. Mike Merles actually had a quote today that I read right when I was thinking about this podcast that I want to mention as well. And you probably already saw it. He said, the art of a good DM is realizing that the more a player's actions messes with your plans, the more interesting the game will be. Mm-hmm. Got retweeted 194 times and favorited 655 times. So clearly people resonated with that idea.
Yeah, I retweeted and favorited that this morning because, man, how relevant to what we're talking about, but also how true, how true about collaborative storytelling. And I do feel that if you as a player buy into the story and it helps the other players buy in, but it also then helps when you do go off script, be it by accident or be it because you have a really great plan that the GM just didn't think of, it ends up being great, and the GM is more likely to follow you down your rabbit hole, which is excellent. So, be good players, be good GMs, and it should all work out. And also, don't be afraid to be honest with each other and talk out a game and say, I just need 5 minutes to think about this library with the Necronomicon in it. Or as a player, contribute things when asked. Don't be afraid to add some details when you are asked. And never add that detail of like, tell me something about this monster. Well, it's made of paper to make your life easier, or that sort of thing.
Fireball!
Right, exactly. So before we go, where can people find you on the internet, Mike Shea?
Slyflourish.com and twitter.com/slyflourish.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on again, Mike. And very excited. This podcast will go up on Monday, which is also the day that you will be talking about your most recent DM's Deep Dive conversation with Enrique Bertrand, which was a great one. Go to Mike's website and you can get all the details there. Ruth, where can people find you?
That's an excellent question right now. I say that because recent events in U.S. politics have sort of wampled my online presence. You can find me generally on Twitter at Cthulhu Chick if I'm around. So I'm mostly hanging around in private Slacks and archives, honestly. Find me underground next to dank books.
And you could check out Pre-Order Cthulhu Confidential, and you can see
pre-order
it's amazing work.
You get the PDF now and the hardback when it comes out.
There you go. And Wade Rockett, where can people find you?
Well, I have a eminently Googleable name, so there's one thing. You can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/Wade Rockett. That's Rocket with 2 T's. My blog, which is not kept up so much, but I'll kind of post when I'm going to conventions or whatnot, is rocketscience.com, again with 2 T's. And one thing I neglected to mention in my introduction is that I'm the co-author of the 13th Age Game Master Screen and Resource book. So,
Yeah, you are.
Yeah,
the award-winning.
Yes, we did win an Emmy for it, and I'm pleased as punch. So a lot of what I think about game mastering and a lot of the advice that I have specifically for 13th Age, but also applicable to a lot of other RPGs, is going to be in that book. So yes, it's fantastic. Go buy it.
Well, thank you all so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble today. And Wade, thank you for coming up with the topic.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James.
Wow, that was a great conversation. I know I have a lot of tips and tricks that I will be stealing and bringing into my games. Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and the best way to help it grow and to help others find it is to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your podcatching platform of choice is. To encourage you to do just that, I'm reading one new 5-star review verbatim each episode and crediting the person who left it. Make me say anything you want. Today's 5-star review is entitled Ask and You Shall Receive, and it comes from I Am Stomp. Oh boy, here we go. I Am Stomp says, this review comes from DM Mitch of the Dungeon Masters Block podcast. Mitch wants you all to know that I, James, am an amazing person and you should listen to me podcast. He also wants you to take full advantage of the my invitation to write anything in the review and have them read on air. Boop, bleep, blop, bidoop, shim, sham, walla, walla, bim, bam, shoo, bop, bala, bala, ba, dim, dim, dum, dooby, dooby, doo. Well, that was a great review. By the way, if you are the first to email me after this review has been read, I, James, will gift you access to my social security number. And that, my friends, is a promise. Well, thank you so much, DM Mitch. All I have to say is that the Dungeon Masters Block podcast is wonderful. So wonderful, I think I'll go give it a 5-star review of my own. Revenge is sweet. And if you want to support the show financially, there's an easy way to do it that doesn't cost you any extra. Before you shop on Amazon or DriveThruRPG, go to our website, don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, and click on the banners on the left. Heck, bookmark the links that they take you to make it easy on yourself. Just shop as you normally would. It costs you nothing extra and throws a few pennies on the dollar into our pouches to help cover our operating costs. Okay, people, you can find everything I do on Twitter at James Introcaso. That's at JAMESINTROCASO. And on my website, worldbuilderblog.me. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Special thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you are listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Until next time, remember that RPGs are like sex. If everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.